Last week, I started the sermon on the hope in God by talking about how we live in a broken world. How we look around and we see all sorts of problems and challenges. We see people afflicted with AIDS and impacted by the HIV virus. We see violence that I've already alluded to just a moment ago around the world. We see political and economic distress in our country. Each of us have health or emotional or financial concerns, either for us personally or for someone close to us that we care about. I stand here this morning to affirm nothing's changed. We still live in a broken world. However, just as nothing's changed with our world's brokenness, we have hope in God, as we saw last week. God is the only source of true hope. And for us, we can also be reassured and be thankful that not only is God our only source of hope, He's enough to bring us that hope, and He promises to do so. This week we shift from that 30,000-foot theological foundational view of hope to practical, on the ground, in daily life ways that we can seek to realize that hope by having personal peace in our lives. Today's text that Melissa read earlier comes from Psalm 34. And many psalms have what we call a superscription. Melissa didn't read the superscription to Psalm 34, but it reads of David when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left. Superscriptions are where often we decide who perhaps wrote the psalm. And that's not necessarily the case. This may be a psalm that David wrote, or it may be a psalm that has come to be identified with a specific instance in David's life. This particular case where David pretended to be insane to save his skin. The superscription's probably referring to an incident recounted in 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David was in the presence of a Palestinian king, Achish, king of Gath. Notice the different name of the king. We don't really know why that is. Many people think that Abimelech is just a generic reference to Palestinian kings, the same way Pharaoh is for Egyptian kings. But what we know is that unlike most other psalms attributed to David or that David is referenced in, this is not the voice of a powerful king who is in his glory and in public acclaim. This is the voice of someone who's on the run. He's running from King Saul at the time when they're starting to get some tension between Saul and David over who should be the true king of Israel. And David is in a city outside of Israel, and the king's people find him. And if you go back and you read that 1 Samuel reference, basically you're going to say David started acting nutty. He started drooling. It says that spittle got in his beard. And the king said, "Why on earth are you bringing this crazy man to me? Get him out of here." And so they let David go. David escapes. And now David, having been rescued from an adverse situation, records his thoughts. I already alluded to it in the lighting of the peace candle, but true peace through God is more than the absence of conflict. Peace requires God's presence with us. This psalm is such a vivid reminder of that, an illustration of that. The psalmist uses the personal name of God. We translate it normally Lord in all caps in our English Bibles. It's Yahweh in the Hebrew, we think, because it's actually not even pronounced by Orthodox Jews. It's so sacred. But this personal name of God is used 10 times in this chapter of Psalms. God is a personal God, one whom we can rely on to be with us. Not only does peace require God's presence, but peace requires action on our part. It's not just a feeling, it's not just a reaction to circumstances. Peace requires affirmative action on our part. Like the personal name of God, the psalmist uses 8 commands or 8 imperative verbs in our text today. 8 of the 14 verses tell us to do something. True peace requires God's presence and requires action on our part. So what are some of these actions that are required? The first one we see in verse 2, where the psalmist says, I will glory in the Lord, and then continues in verse 3 with this imperative, glorify God. If we are focusing on God and God's presence and what God's done for us, who God is, giving God the glory, it changes things. It changes our attitudes and our outlooks. And the psalmist recognized that. That's why we come here on Sundays to worship, to give God the glory, to praise God's name, to bring our requests to God in our pastoral prayer time, and to remember the things that God has done for us, so that then when we leave this safe place, we can go out in the tough world in the right mindset to face whatever the world throws at us. The psalmist continues that even though God is present and with them, they seek the Lord, knowing that God will answer them. In verse 4 he says, God delivered me from all my fears. And continues, those who look to him are radiant. Radiant is another sign of the glory of God with us. The psalmist continues talking about seeking God. I sought the Lord in verse 6. This poor man, probably not a financial situation, but rather an emotional situation. This poor man is one who just escaped by acting crazy. Called to God, and again, God answers. The Lord saved him. He continues in verse 8, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. That word translated one in our text today is one of my favorite words for some odd reason from seminary, from my Old Testament classes, and from Hebrew. It's a word that's probably most literally translated strong man. It has the image of somebody in a walled castle, somebody who's secure, somebody who's safe from attack, somebody in that day who's probably relatively wealthy. And here it says this strong person, this strong man does what? takes refuge in his castle and says, boy, am I good. No. The strong man knows that despite the outward appearances of strength, they need God. And that's who they turn to for reference. We lose some of these nuances when we translate from one language in another. But this is a reminder that no matter how good we think we've got it, we'd better remember where our good that we got came from. It came from God, and as long as we keep looking to God, glorifying God, seeking God, then we can have God's peace. We stop doing that, and we lose the peace that we're seeking. The psalmist continues along this idea of fearing God. And of course, this is not fear in the sense of being scared of. This is a revering God, remembering to be awed by God's presence and what God has done for us. Again, remembering to glorify and to give God the credit. And as long as we fear the God, then we lack nothing. Or a more literal translation is, we will have all of our requirements met. We'll have everything given to us in sufficient amounts. Again, the literal, a little bit more gets this idea of God meets our needs rather than our wants. If we fear God, glorify God, remember God's presence, and seek God, God assures that we have what we need. And let's go ahead and be honest, sometimes it may not be what we think we need. It may not even be something that we actually do need, such as money to pay the mortgage or money to put food on the table. But God assures us that the real need of His presence, His comfort, and His ability for us to work within whatever means God provides will work out, and our needs will be met. Then the close of the psalm, the last 3 verses, kind of wraps this theme of seeking God's peace up and gives us a few more ways to do it. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. That verse 12, whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days. An alternative reading of those plural verbs is, rather than literally, to read them as abstractions. Rather than many days, perhaps the psalmist is saying, those of you who desire full days, days that are full of life on a daily basis. And actually, I will back up and correct what I just said. I got ahead of my mouth got ahead of myself, and I confused my 2 words. Many lives, or a long life, really means a full life. And then rather than many days, means on a daily basis. In other words, each day seeking a full life. If that's what you wish to have, living one day at a time, full life on a daily basis, then do good while you reject evil. This isn't a new idea. The prophets, particularly Amos, talks about rejecting sin and doing good. The psalmist is saying, and boy, does this hit home today, doesn't it? Keep your tongue from evil. Or your Facebook mouse, or your Twitter fingers, or your Instagram pictures, or whatever. Keep them from evil. Keep your lips from telling lies. Be truthful in what you say. Turn from evil and do good. And in doing so, seek peace and pursue it. The Westminster Catechism, question number 1, asks, what is the chief purpose of man? What are we doing here? The answer is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. They don't reference this psalm when they say that, but I think the psalmist knew that when he said it. We've already talked about glorifying God and how it gets us away from our internal thoughts, gets us out of ourselves and out of our problems into the glory of God. So our purpose is to glorify God. But what about this idea of enjoying Him forever? When I first heard this, I thought of the feeling of enjoyment, of pleasure, of happiness, and I think that's part of it. Absolutely, I think we are to enjoy God's relationship, that nearness of this personal God. But I think it goes beyond that. Joy, which we're going to be talking about specifically next week, but joy is more than mere happiness. Happiness is frequently a reaction to what's going on around us, but joy comes from what? Within, from God's presence inside us that comes from what? Glorifying God. So we are to glorify God, give God the glory, and enjoy Him forever. But that's a challenge sometimes. It's legitimate to ask, how do you give glory to the Lord and exalt His name when life seems to be crashing down in front of you? How do you give glory in the Lord and exalt His name when you see all the division and bitterness exhibited by so many around us? How do you give glory to the Lord and exalt His name when there are more to-do items on your daily list than there are hours in the day? I'll stick my hand up for that one. Many cry out from God to be delivered and expect God to take away our darkness, to take away our problems, but things don't work that way. Sometimes God chooses to do that. But more frequently, in my experience, what happens is that God has promised to be with us. He's promised His presence. He's promised to give us what we need to live with the dark and the gloom and the problems around us, the adversity and the trouble. We can come to live with the tough things in life crashing down around us, the division and bitterness we see, the other adversities, so long as we remember how blessed we are and that the Lord is with us and acting to save us. I'm going to go ahead and tell a personal story, and it probably goes along the ideas of be careful what you wish for. This morning I knew that I was preaching on God's peace. And I knew that my point was that peace is more than the absence of conflict, that it comes from the knowing presence of a personal God. And guess what my morning was like this morning? I have 2 computers at home. I couldn't print out my sermon notes. I spend about a half an hour trying to get things working, finally barely get things printed out. I haven't even had a chance to review and do my final last changes or whatever that I do. So am I at peace, do you imagine? Not really. But I keep trying to thank God and say, it's going to be okay because you are in this place. You are with me. And then about the time I got here in the normal hustle and bustle of a Sunday morning in church, God kept reminding me, you know what you're preaching on today, don't you? Didn't you want a little bit of last-minute practice of peace in the midst of daily life? In the overall scheme of things, not that tragic a morning. But trust me, in my head and my heart, it was distressing. But God gave me peace because I kept remembering that He was with me. So no matter what we face, God is with us. Sheryl Crow released an album called Detours in 2008, and in that album, there's a song called Out of Our Heads. And the words of the song cry out for us to get out of our heads and into our hearts. She goes on to sing that it's by laying down our fears, swallowing our tears, and looking into our heart that we come back to life. Similarly, we as followers of Jesus Christ have little hope of encountering God just in our heads. We need to encounter Him in our hearts. God isn't just in our fears. We've got to get out of our fears, recognize that fears are our enemies. And when we believe somebody else is our enemy, then we start treating them as the other, and we're afraid of them. We call them our enemy out of fear. But this position of fear, this position of pushing others unlike us away, is not a position of God's blessing or God's love. God's love and blessing comes with open arms of love and compassion. And to experience that love and blessing, we must go to our hearts, lay down our fears, and swallow our tears. Somewhere along the line, we got the idea that life's supposed to be fair. We got the idea that being secure and unassailable is what would give us peace. I don't know where that came from, but that's not the way life works. We carry that further and say that we get what we deserve in both a good and a bad way. We do bad, we get bad things that we deserve. We do good, we get good things we deserve. Again, that's not the way life always works. And let's be honest, all of us deserve what? Ultimately, punishment and hell. Because we've rebelled against God, but God in His grace gives us hope that we talked about last week. And in God's grace, that hope can be realized in the form of personal peace inside us. I'll close by talking about exactly what peace the psalmist is referring to in this psalm. Again, as I've said numerous times, the psalmist isn't talking about the absence of conflict, but the psalmist is talking about more than that. The word he uses is one that you've probably heard before, shalom. It's more than just this idea of the absence of war, the absence of conflict. It's this idea of wholeness, completeness. Remember the psalmist talking about how God will give us what we need, that God will fill our insufficiencies. That's the peace. God gives us wholeness and completeness to face the world that we live in. And we do that by giving God the glory, by seeking God's face, by rejecting evil and doing good, and by remembering where our peace comes from. We find shalom, peace in a community, when we lay down our fears, we quit putting people down, we quit seeking our self-interest and start following Jesus' example and doing what? Seeking the interest of others. There's a favorite song of ours at Christmas time, that being Barb and mine. She's already made a Facebook posting about it, about giving this Christmas away. The idea of sharing God's blessing, getting out of ourselves. Perfect example of how we are doing that as a church body here is the angel tree in the back. We're sharing God's blessings with others. That's part of the doing good that we talk about, that the psalmist is talking about. But I challenge all of us to go beyond that and again to check what we do during the week. Let's again recommit ourselves, particularly in this time of celebrating the presence of God through Jesus Christ, to testing everything we say, everything we write, everything we post by 3 tests. Is it true? If it's not, forget it. But even if it's true, is it kind? Or some people say necessary, and depending on the circumstances, one or the other might fit a little better. Is it kind or necessary? If it's not, ditch it. It's best left unsaid. And finally, even if it's true, even if it's kind or necessary, is it helpful? Does it actually contribute to the good of others? And if it doesn't, let's leave it alone. A friend of mine used to try and live by the code, I'd rather be kind than right. I think that's part of the peace that God will give us. When we remember that everything we have and everything that we are comes from God, that we are no better than anybody else around us. And so if we seek to share God's love in this time of the greatest gift of all that we celebrate on December 25th, if we try and show God's love by being kind, that will give us the inner peace that God promises us.